The one, the only, the classic Halloween.
Been on 3 weeks or so.
What is it?
In this essay, I aim to explore the topic of gender ideology, and more specifically the impact it's had on the history of the film industry. The term ideology refers to a system of shared beliefs by which a group of people interpret and impart meaning to events. Connolly, 1997. The more specific gender ideology refers to a set of beliefs held about how men and women should behave and the roles they ought to fill in society. By exploring this through a view of patriarchal studio systems being able to push their own gender ideology onto their film, you can track the societal views of how different genders are supposed to act in any time and how this portrayal has changed year by year in the film industry. Angry displays of force may belong to the male, but crying, cowering, screaming, fainting, trembling, begging for mercy belong to the female. Abject terror, in short, is gendered feminine, and the more concerned a given film is with that condition, and it is the essence of modern horror, the more likely the femaleness of the victim. Carol Clover's Men, Women and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. Throughout the history of the horror film, the portrayal of female characters has always been distinctly different than that of their male counterparts. Tracking through this history allows you to see different perceptions of characters women were allowed to appear as in film, especially when we look at horror films, as it shows us how we expect women to act when faced with a very specific emotion, fear, and how when faced with this very specific emotion, these character types can be broken down into 3 main groups. I aim to break down the epigraph provided and explain how character tropes that women are allowed to be almost always fit into these groups, and that the portrayal of them in horror reflect the societal views of women during the period. Starting off with The Final Girl. Clover's Final Girl theory refers to the last remaining woman left alive at the end of a horror film, most commonly slasher films, and is almost always the main character, having suffered the most throughout and having earned the right to survive the attacker pursuing them. The concept of a final or survivor girl can be tracked through many horror classics, with many arguing that Marilyn Burns' portrayal of Sally Hardesty in Tobe Hooper's 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the first true portrayal of a classic final girl. I personally would argue that Mina Harker from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula and its following film adaptations would be better considered as an archetypal if not the first final girl, but that doesn't really matter. More importantly, what classifies a true final girl, and how does the character type contribute to my argument that women's portrayal in horror reflects society's opinions on how they should behave? The easiest way to explain that is again to quote Clover from her essay, Her Body, Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film. The relation between the sexes in slasher films could hardly be clearer. The killer is, with a few exceptions, recognizably human and distinctly male. His fury is unmistakably sexual in both roots and expression. His victims are mostly women, often sexually free and always young and beautiful. Now, to explain this quote, I feel like a film example would be useful, so I've selected Sean Cunningham's 1980s slasher Friday the 13th.
That's my good boy.
This film follows Alice Hardy, Adrienne King, as her and fellow counsellors attempt to reopen a lakeside camp with tragic history. Like most slashers, the cast are young and attractive and engage in the expected sinful activities, most poignantly having sex and doing drugs, but not Alice. While her friends are having skinny-dipped adventures and subsequent skinny-dipped murders, Alice is playing Monopoly. But why do these films feel so consistently justified in the murder of the free and the survival of the innocents? Well, in many ways, the traditional final girl figure reflects and reinforces the classic idea that a woman's worth is dictated by how well they can follow a man's rules. There's obvious ties to a Christian influence in these years, but I think it comes down more to what directors thought a woman's character should be. If she can be the ideal role model for the impressionable female viewer, she's allowed to live. If she's too headstrong, too strong-willed, and too wild, she dies. Derek Soules argues that the tragic destiny of such final girls represents an expression of patriarchal society, where capable, independent women must either be contained by adhering to ideals such as being bookish or innocent or pure, or destroyed by being slammed in a sleeping bag into a tree by Jason Voorhees. Either way, the final girl reflects a very distinct binary on what is allowed in young teenage female characters and what isn't, and I think they illustrate that quite violently and quite well. The next category I'll be covering in this essay is the mother. And more importantly, the binary representation of the mother in horror films. Melodrama and motherhood suggest a binary in horror films whereby a mother or mother figure will be painted as either good or bad. This black and white depiction leaves no room for nuance or any allowance for human flaw. Also, what constitutes a good or a bad mother relies heavily on the political and cultural standpoints of the audience at large. In this way, mothers in horror films act as a marker of how motherhood, and thus what constitutes acceptable motherhood, is in the context of the time and place the films were made. Sarah Arnold, author of the maternal horror film. Now, the idea of a good mother is often misleading, with the trope normally coming from a self-sacrificing maternal figure, often overshadowed by a larger paternal force and therefore only given the agency of protecting and raising her children. And while these ideals are not necessarily bad, they reflect a much more sinister motive. The easiest way to explain this is to look at what constitutes a bad mother in film. Drawing from horrors such as 1973's The Exorcist, 2002's The Ring, and 1988's Child Play, these bad maternal figures are often those who reject traditional motherly roles. They're often depicted as single, struggling, and have prioritized their career in front of their family, with often no regard given to the idea of a balance between career and children, with the film shaming these mothers and the supposed happy ending being them either relinquishing their agency of work to stay with their children, or their death due to their incompetence in protecting them. It is you who have done it. Yes, you. With your career before anything. Your career before your husband, before her. The mother also has a presence in the gore of horror, with the idea of new life and body horror, and for this definition I will turn to Barbara Creed's The Monstrous Feminine and her chapter, Horror and the Archaic Mother. The primal scene is also crucial to Alien, as is the figure of the mother, in the guise of the archaic mother. The archaic mother is the parthenogenic mother, the mother as primordial abyss, the point of origin and of end. Although the archaic mother, the creature who laid the eggs, is never seen in Alien, her presence is signalled in a number of ways. She is there in the text's various representations of the primal scene, and its depiction of birth and death. She is there in the film's images of blood, darkness, and death. Barbara Creed, The Monstrous Feminine. Now, the term archaic mother is quite a complicated one, but it boils down into quite a simple idea. It's an idea of a primitive, pre-symbolic, untraditional maternal figure, a predecessor to any modern expectation of motherhood. Personally, I think this figure can be seen in almost all horror if you search hard enough, but a modern example is the creature from the 2022 Barbarian, appearing as both nurturing and devouring, simultaneously providing life and threatening it. Delving deeper into Creed's theory on the archaic mother in Alien explores how Xenomorph's life cycle functions as a manifestation of the maternal role, being a symbolic figure of the mother. The creature's parasite-like grotesque life cycle is reflective of humans, specifically the impregnation and then subsequent emergence of a new creature from within one's own body. The choice to create horror from this internal process, one that is so primal to our lives and one that exists in the woman's world at all times, creates more horror than the actual imagery ever could. So again, the idea of the womanhood or motherhood is contorted in horror. Now, this last group is a bit more complicated than the other two, but I still think it's a necessary category and one that can encapsulate the last remaining demographic of female characters. We've discussed the portrayals of the young victims of horror, and then the portrayals of the terrible parenting styles used to raise them, ranging from using a Chucky doll as a replacement to a hands-off chest burst my child method. And we've looked at what all of these character types represent, especially when looking into the context and the stereotypes of each. But what do you get if you are neither the fleeing teenager or the controlling crazy mother? What about displays of femininity where a more malicious personality is present? Well, you end up with a third and final group, discussed in this essay. The monstrous. Now, by this term, I don't necessarily mean a monster that is female, but more examples of evil committed by women and the power and the influences that these characters have and what leads them to these acts. One of them, the masculine, apparently victorious, confesses through its very relentlessness against the other, the feminine, that it is threatened by an asymmetrical, irrational, wily, uncontrollable power. Julia Kristeva, Powers of Horror. This quote from renowned Bulgarian French philosopher Julia Kristeva explores how we view power and violence in terms of the binary between male and female. The quote suggests that while masculinity often uses relentless violence to assert dominance and control, the opposite can be said about feminine violence, which supposedly comes from a place of irrationality or uncontrollability. 2004's Saw is an example of masculine conditions of violence, an incredibly grotesque film where threat of violence is used as a way of controlling a person's actions, with John Kramer intending to force his victims to prove that they are worthy and deserving to continue living, with the victims learning to abandon what he perceives to be their vices. So, what are examples of violence from a female perspective, where their actions are less ordered and apparently wilder? My first choice is a film I've already used a lot of footage from, mainly because I think it's one of the most interesting horror films of the last 50 years, with that film being 1976's Carrie. Based originally on Stephen King's novel, this film centers on Carrie White, a shy, bullied girl who upon reaching puberty begins to develop telekinetic powers. The film is, at its core, a messed up coming-of-age story, with the catalyst being something known to all teenage girls. Carrie's power starts to grow the moment she gets her first period. The film doesn't demonize this per se, but more shows how a lack of knowledge and a general ostracization from those around you can turn puberty into a nightmare of hormones and, in this case, telekinesis. Carrie's entrance into womanhood in turn begins her entrance into monsterhood, finding the ability to move things with her mind, the ability often being used to violence against her will. Carrie's use of telekinesis often occurs either with the appearance of blood or with a focus on her nakedness and changing body, shown the best in the shower or at prom, where she is covered in pig's blood by her bullies. So, Carrie's powers represent an uncontrollable, irrational, feminine force of chaos. The climactic scene where Carrie unleashes her powers in a violent outburst symbolizes the horrifying consequences of suppressing this feminine rage. The story of Carrie tells a tale of fear of female rage, one that is strong in the 70s to 80s, with society still having a very stereotypical view of what a woman should act like. Another side of the woman as a monster is the sexuality that is inherently tied. A fitting example of this is 1983's The Hunger. This film explores how a woman's terror is tied to her sexuality, with the film following a rich and seductive vampire who, in the most horrifying turn for 80s audiences, engages in both non-monogamous sex, but even more scandalous, the use of a lesbian, or at least a sexually fluid woman, as a predator. Even worse, it was released at the very beginning of the AIDS crisis. But this is only one example of a link between female horror and sexuality. Think of female monsters like sirens, mermaids, or succubus, whose terror lies in their seductive nature, leading innocent men into their sexual ways. These examples not only tie a woman's sexuality to evil, most likely from a Christian influence, but displays a society that can only view women as scary if they are also sexual.